I'd like to invite everyone to join us this evening at 4 p.m. Central for a Zoom conversation about this sermon and the important topics that I'm addressing. You can write to me at Reverend Dr. Ray at outlook.com, or if you just go to our Facebook page, The Emerging Church, I'll put a Zoom address up there for you to get. But please do join us. It's always nice to hear from those who are listeners in our far-flung global audience, and it's even today going to be interesting to debate whether you agree with me or not. So there's that. Like many of you, I have a brother with whom I have found it nearly impossible to talk for the last few years. We were once pretty close, though I've always been a liberal and he's always been a conservative, but till a few years ago, we always found ways to communicate in spite of our differences. My brother and I visited with one another across the 500 miles that have geographically separated us for the past many years, both during Democratic presidential administrations and Republican. We disagreed politely about our nation's responses to 9/11 without rancor, discussing our differing views on things, even things as important and controversial as our war in Iraq, which he thought was necessary, I was convinced was illegal and based on falsified evidence. I, of course, was right about that war, but it still didn't keep us from having Thanksgiving dinners together or visiting regularly. What was different about the 2016 election was that the choice to support Donald Trump was not fundamentally a political difference. I would never stop talking to my brother over political differences. It wasn't politics, it was ethics. And more specifically, a lack of ethics. Trump's spying on underage beauty contestants as they change clothing, his unwanted sexual advances towards dozens of women, even bragging about being able to grab them by the genitals, just made this father of a young daughter's blood boil. And more than that, my daughter is brown. My daughter is an immigrant, none of which would have been lost on my brother, who has known her since she was 4 months old. So what Trump had to say about people of color and immigrants is not a matter of ethics or not a matter of politics. It's a matter of ethics. And for me, it was a matter of family. For years, when I've been traveling through my brother's hometown in Birmingham, Alabama, I've stayed with lesbian friends of mine there and brought them with me when I met my brother for breakfast. And so Trump's ardent anti-gay rhetoric wasn't political for me either. It was personal, and he knew that. He knew the names of the people that I loved enough to visit and stay with. The last time I was in Birmingham, I stayed with black friends, and I didn't even let my brother know that I was in town because I knew how he would feel about that. Again, not a matter of politics, but a matter of ugly, indefensible racism. But on Christmas Day, we agreed to try to start talking again. The Trump era is either over or it is ending, and it's time, I believe, for us to begin to try to rebuild bridges and connections with the 1/3 of America, including our own family members, who, even if they don't want to wear the label of being racist or misogynist or xenophobic or homophobic or Islamophobic, they certainly were not bothered by those things enough to refrain from voting for someone who most certainly was all of those things. So where do we begin to start a conversation that has been completely stalled for 5 years? At least for my brother and me, we talked about where our kids are. He's got grandkids to talk about. We have cousins, and some of them have even died since we talked last. We talked about the weather and gardening and retirement and our shared niece and nephews. We avoided the known triggers, but if we're going to get back to a close relationship, we're going to have to talk about the serious things eventually. I still don't know how. You could almost feel the whole world heaving a sigh of relief on Wednesday of this week. Donald Trump left the White House, stripped of his ability to tweet, and he just flew off to Florida. Of course, a last insult, apparently he fired the household staff, so there would be no one there literally to unlock the door to let Biden and Jill in to the White House. But, you know, petty defines what his administration has been. If you're anything at all like me, you shed a few surprising tears Wednesday during the inauguration of Biden and Harris. I loved everything that was said. I loved everything that was sung. I loved especially what was read, but what I loved the most was what didn't happen. Of course, there were 25,000 National Guard soldiers there to make sure that nothing untoward happened. But since the brazen and treasonous insurrection of 2 Wednesdays ago, we've all been sitting on the edge of our seats, hoping that the right-wing militias would not show up to disrupt the inauguration. President Biden especially said the right things. And again, more than what he said, I'm grateful for what he didn't say. He didn't even mention Trump by name. He didn't mention the ongoing impeachment. And he didn't mention the names of senators and members of Congress who spun up the insurrection and continued to feed lies to the insurrectionists even while they were in the Capitol building. And that is the right thing for President Biden to do. It's the right thing for him to talk about, to advocate for, to pray for unity. But the right thing for the Justice Department to do is to pursue justice. And for the media, as well as our nation's pulpits, to demand ethics. I believe that it is vitally important for our country to become united again, in as much as we ever have been, but we've got to get back to a sense of ourselves as Americans. I believe it's important for families, for neighborhoods, for workplaces, to become civil again, to get past the incivility and rudeness that has entered the public dialogue. And I believe that Biden is playing the role that was dealt to him. But the role for the rest of us needs to be a little bit different. I believe there are 2 things that must happen. We must have a renewed commitment to what is true. And I believe that we need to find a sincere contrition on the part of those who have actively or passively attempted to replace democracy with what can only be called fascism. Over the past 2 generations, shameless lying has become almost an acceptable political technique. Trump, however, has been so dishonest for so long that, when he announced over the last 3 years that he was going to release his health care plan within the next week or 2, we all knew he didn't have a health care plan, that he had no intentions of preparing one, because he was all in for defending insurance company profits, no matter how many Americans died. And when he promised last fall a middle-class tax cut that would be passed before the November election, Congress wasn't even in session. No one had even drafted legislation for another middle-class tax cut. Everyone knew that he was lying because he's a liar, and that's what he does. And we had gotten to a point where we didn't even expect anything different from him. We've grown accustomed to constant public propaganda and a host of criminal financial dealings and election manipulation through foreign powers, but also the big lie, the lie that the election was stolen from him, that he had won by millions of votes, that it was a landslide, the lie he used to give his supporters the courage to literally launch an insurrection against the legislative branch of government, to overthrow the election and to seize power, even if that meant literally hanging the Vice President of the United States on the Capitol lawn and probably killing other legislative leaders such as Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, Majority Leader now of the Senate Chuck Schumer, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is a threat to every man who's insecure about educated, intelligent, and talented women. An attempted coup demands retribution. What I have found especially disturbing is that after this failed coup, in the wee hours of the morning, some of the senators who caused the insurrection came to the floor of the Senate and doubled down on the big lie. Our own junior senator, Josh Hawley, a Yale Law School graduate who has clerked in the Supreme Court, repeated the big lie, not because he's stupid, he's not, but because he believes that he is able to manipulate people who are stupid by simply repeating a lie they want to believe. Hours after the rioters had been removed from the Senate chambers, Josh Hawley stood at the lectern grinning and lying as if he had no concept of moral responsibility and no fear that he would be prosecuted for crimes. And this week, after President Biden signed several executive orders trying to bring the United States back into the community of Western democracies, Senator Ted Cruz took exception to President Biden rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement. And he tweeted that President Biden was showing more deference towards the opinions of people who live in Paris than he was to protecting jobs in Pittsburgh. Again, trying to act like the Paris Accord was something cooked up in the coffee shops of Paris. Thankfully, AOC called him out and tweeted, "Do you believe that the Geneva Convention was about the views of citizens in Geneva?" Asking for everyone who believes U.S. senators should be competent and not undermine our elections to incite insurrection against the United States. And again, folks, Ted Cruz is not stupid. He's a Harvard Law School grad who also clerked in the Supreme Court. He's just a liar who thinks that he can manipulate stupid people by lying to them. Ted Cruz knows that the Paris Accord was written by and approved by 190 nations. And if you've not counted your globe lately, there's only 197 nations in the world. So we were not a part of the Paris Agreement during Trump's administration, and we joined the company of oil-producing states, Iraq, Iran, Yemen, Turkey, the Sudan, and Eritrea. That tiny group of oil-producing countries against the rest of the world, when many other oil-producing countries recognized that we still needed to save the planet, even if we were trying to pump oil out of the ground. There are perfectly good reasons not to be excited about the Paris Accord. When it was first signed in 2015, when Obama was in office, I immediately published an opinion column in our local newspaper calling it what Confucius described as putting plaster on a dung wall. It was far too little to actually accomplish the necessary goals of saving our environment. But Cruz was attempting to manipulate his followers by suggesting that even joining this nearly toothless Paris Accord, that we were somehow genuflecting to the whims of the French, something that his South Texas constituents wouldn't like. I think that it should be illegal for elected officials to lie to the public about things over which our government has either governance or credibility. Shouldn't it be illegal, for example, to tell people that they should drink bleach to cure a COVID-19 infection, or to insist that hydroxychloroquine was a legitimate treatment when medical science has insisted on the opposite? And it seems to me that Facebook and Twitter are going to have to accept some larger responsibility for being news outlets, if that's where most people get their news, that their role in simply repeating conspiracy theories, lies, and even foreign propaganda. I mean, I understand Facebook can't look at every post, but if an advertiser is paying you in rubles, shouldn't that send up a red flag? Former Trump spokesperson Kellyanne Conway famously coined the phrase alternative facts. But that paradoxical phrase was just a new take on what the Reagan administration used to call Reagan's egregious lies. His spokespersons would say that the president had simply misspoken. In fact, you could almost say that Reagan was the king of misspoke, because it was Reagan who forced the FCC to back off of their requirements that news agencies either report only objective facts or at least give both sides of an issue fair enough exposure to allow their audience to decide for themselves. Reagan vetoed the fairness doctrine because he said, and this was 1987, so this was a long time ago, but he said that by keeping news agencies from lying, that they were inhibiting free speech. Protecting lies and propaganda as free speech paved the way for the creation of conspiracy theory spreading organizations like Fox News, as well as the whole universe of talk radio shows that turned paranoia, prejudice, and hatred into kinds of entertainment. People would listen to that poison for hours at a time because it was distracting, it was exciting, it was thrilling, but it kept feeding their id, the absolute worst aspects of society. It has damaged what it means to be American. But we have lately seen that it also becomes a way of influencing the outcome of national elections. And it may have even paved the way for fascists to be able to overthrow our democracy. After years of opposing anything good that Obama tried to do for our country, and then protecting Trump from the consequences of every crime that he committed against America, finally, even Mitch McConnell came to the floor of the Senate and said that the January 6th insurrection had happened because President Trump and other powerful people had fed the public a steady diet of lies. Now, I recognize that McConnell never speaks or acts on principle, and so I am sure that his real motivation was to separate the Republican Party from Trump's influence. But still, he did finally say something that was true. It was true and it was relevant. And even though he did not name the names of Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley as being the powerful people who were directly responsible for the insurrection, we all knew who he was talking about, and you can bet that Hawley and Cruz knew who he was talking about. It took seeing thousands of misinformed, manipulated insurrectionists who have been fed lies for months coming to literally kill members of Congress and the Senate, or even the vice president, for Mitch to realize that it was time for him to turn the page and tell the truth. We have reached an unsustainable situation in our public discourse, where the difference between hard facts and totally senseless opinions are treated as if they have the same value. As if the difference between watching Fox News or watching CNN was simply a matter of personal preference, as if alternative facts were just as good as facts. Freedom of speech never included yelling fire in a crowded theater. What we have learned in the past few years is that allowing Russian disinformation farms to post lies and conspiracy theories on Facebook and Twitter, allowing a president or a senator to tweet about election fraud or stolen elections, that can be worse than yelling fire in a crowded theater. 5 people died in that Capitol insurrection on January 6th, but it could have easily been 5,000. And if those heavily armed hillbillies had been able to start a civil war over racism and tribal paranoia, folks, it could have been 5 million. The highest casualty rate in terms of percentage of population in the history of America was our Civil War, because in a civil war, everyone is vulnerable to violence from their own neighbors. And that's the kind of war the insurrectionists were trying to start. My first point is that we need a new and powerful devotion to the truth. Folks, hate speech is not entertainment. Lies are not a good source for thrill-seeking around the television set in the commons room of nursing homes. We need a new fairness doctrine that has teeth in it, that forces the media to become reliable sources of information. And elected officials who intentionally deceive the public should face more than being censored or sanctioned or even expelled from their elected post. There really has to be jail time for those kinds of lies, as there already is in most Western democracies. There is no real lasting freedom of speech unless it is also connected to some kind of responsibility. And for way too long, churches, synagogues, temples, mosques have been allowed to peddle fairy tales as facts. Folks, the pulpit should be held to the same standard as journalists, if not higher. Why do we allow the clergy to lie when they are supposed to be setting the standard for character, for trustworthiness, for reliability? Please, there is an important wall that separates the church from the state, but there shouldn't be a smokescreen that separates the pulpit from reality. Okay, my second point, and I'll try to make this brief since I know I'm already out of time, but please do join me in our Zoom discussion this evening. Let's talk about this some more. But finally, I believe that if we are a nation of laws, we have to stop making exceptions for the rich and the powerful. I'm sympathetic with President Biden wanting to look ahead and not look back. I understand why we don't typically prosecute presidents for things that they did wrong while they were in office, for the sake of not using the Justice Department simply to either prosecute or persecute our political rivals. And I get that people in government often make policy decisions that have questionable aspects to them, depending upon what they or their party values. In 2017, as soon as he took office, Trump gave permission to the Dakota Access Pipeline to finish construction. Now, in 2021, on his first day in office, Joe Biden reversed that decision. One president showed favor to business and profit. The other is deciding to favor clean water and respecting Native American tribal lands. You know where I come down on that issue, but that doesn't mean that Trump should go to prison for the decision that he made about the pipeline, that is. We must view his months of telling deranged and gullible followers that the 2020 election had been stolen from him and that they should march down to the Capitol building by the thousands and disrupt democracy, overthrow the election, as being like an executive order giving permission to build a pipeline through the Missouri River. One was a political decision. The other was sedition. They're not the same. People can make political decisions that you disagree with, even on moral and ethical grounds, but it's still a political decision. But the decision to send thousands of rioters into the Capitol building, that was sedition. That was treason. And it ended up being murder. And that should come with criminal charges. You don't prosecute differences in political decisions. But folks, was separating children from their parents at the border and then even losing the children or losing the paperwork on where the parents were, it was in order to achieve a political goal. But if the process of achieving a political goal literally, institutionally traumatizes children, that isn't politics, is it? Isn't that child abuse? Are we the kind of people who would shrug our shoulders in the face of child abuse of tens of thousands of children? Does a president, an attorney general, a State Department get to just walk away from that? In my mind, there's no amount of whataboutism or playing all butthurt about being a victim all the time that can be used to shout down a call for justice. Look, Colorado's new member of Congress, Lauren Boebert, is a QAnon conspiracy theory believer. She's also a woman who thinks that she has a right to wear her Glock pistol everywhere, including in Congress. That's stupid, but stupid isn't necessarily a crime. But she is so mired in her sense of personal privilege and her sense that liberals are evil that during the January 6th insurrection, it appears that she was tweeting out the location of the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, literally helping the insurrectionists to find and murder her. She has been credibly accused of giving tours of the Capitol building to insurrectionists in the days leading up to the January 6th insurrection. And during their march on the Capitol, she was tweeting, "It's 1776. It doesn't take a poet to interpret what she meant by that. And Lauren Boebert is still walking around free. She's still attending sessions of Congress, even when there are members of Congress saying they don't feel safe because they are afraid that another member of Congress might try to kill them. Colorado should be ashamed of having elected a high school dropout who wants to eliminate the education department. What does that sound like? But that is politics, and that's up to the voters in Colorado to choose. But sedition, being a co-conspirator in insurrection and attempted murder, voters don't get to make that decision, and they cannot credibly complain if she is removed from office and put in prison. At 4 p.m. this evening, I'll give you a chance on Zoom to convince me that I'm wrong. But you should eat your Wheaties. I'm saying that people who assisted in, facilitated, provoked, or participated in the insurrection on January 6th need to spend some years in prison and never serve an elected office again. The crimes that have been committed in recent American history are not matters of politics or personal opinion. They are matters of law, and they threatened to rob this great nation, not only of our international credibility, which has certainly been sullied, but they may have given The next series of wannabe dictators, the boilerplate for a successful coup next time, if these coup instigators are not publicly punished. We were relieved on Wednesday that the 25,000 National Guard soldiers managed to convince the insurrectionists to stay away. I believe that the gracious demeanor of President Biden and Vice President Harris were perfect for that day. But of course, second only to images of Bernie Sanders huddled against the cold in overcoat and mittens that were actually made out of old wool sweaters, was the reading of Amanda Gorman, the 22-year-old Harvard grad, of her poem, The Hill We Climb. In part, she said, "We've seen a force that would shatter our nation rather than share it, would destroy our country if it meant delaying democracy. This effort very nearly succeeded. But while democracy can be periodically delayed, it can never be permanently defeated. In this truth, in this faith, we trust. For while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us. This is the era of just redemption. We feared it at its inception. We did not feel prepared to be the heirs of such a terrifying hour, but within it, we found the power to author a new chapter, to offer hope and laughter to ourselves. So while once we asked, how could we possibly prevail over catastrophe, now we assert, how could we possibly allow it to prevail over us? We, folks, have survived a nightmare. It seemed as if we had lost our way. And in that time, we almost lost our democracy. But now is a time of renewal, of rebuilding, and of restoration of dignity and character. We've got some stuff to fix, but I believe that we can do it, and that we will do it. This is our calling. This is our time to shine.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.